only concession to Friendship Chitra is going to be that I will speak a little bit faster than I had planned to. I am indeed honored to be here in the presence of greatness, sir. Truly inspired by you, much to learn. I also am very deeply grateful to the Hindu for inviting me here. They are probably the last bastion of substance in writing in the nation, and there is a great deal of respect from the community of writers that I belong to. I stand here halfway between academics like Prabir, and activists like Kailash ji here. And I stand halfway, and therefore I cannot tell stories as beautifully as they do, nor do I present structures and issues as the professor has done. Where I stand in a position of impatience. I will quote Kailash ji from this very morning and from the video that he presented. And he says he refuses to accept. I too refuse to accept that we do not have solutions. 1.3 billion people. We have solutions of every level in this country. We may not have the will to do it, we may not have the ability to do it, and we will, and I will be direct and upfront about it, at this stage in the education employability gap, be standing at a point where we are desperately seeking somebody who will step up and say, I will do it. I will present the solution. And therefore, again quoting Kailash ji, and I plan to quote him later on, it's a very simple solution. If not me, then who? And this question goes out to each of us in this room. If not me, then who? It is each of us who is a part of the solution. I'm not going to go down the path of what is education. Very simply, two questions that we traditionally ask. How much do you know? And what do you do with what you know? Knowledge and skills. That's the way we look at it traditionally. It is true that true education makes for a better human being. A true education makes for a person who will improve society, take it to the next level. Whether it is in sciences, whether it is space exploration, whether it is in telling a beautiful story like Star Trek, where no man has gone before, or whether it is exploring the depths of the human soul and building morality, ethics, or whatever tugs our emotions, wherever we take the next step towards humanity, that is where we have succeeded in being educated. But it is also true that India today stands at a point where we have a sense of urgency. We say that we will have to do all these things, each of us as teachers, but we also have a medium-term goal, where we say that each of our children deserves to leave our schools, to grow up, to be able to hold their own in society. And the first thing to hold their own is to be able to sustain themselves. To be able to sustain themselves, they have to be employable, either employable by themselves or employable by other people. And this is where my main plea, my first plea to all of us as teachers, as curriculum developers here is, let us not get trapped in this skills for schools, skills to employability thing. Let us now move on to asking our schools and our institutions to seek value. Are we adding value to our students? We need to move from skills to value. And value is added in many ways. If a child can do a math sum very well, they have added value. If they have the decency to help an old person cross the road, they have added value. If they have learned how to repair a tap, they have added value. We need to now, in our classrooms, seek to build value in whatever we do. And I said I come from a place where I like to seek solutions. And solutions come at an institutional level, at a systemic level. So what do we have at a systemic level? At a systemic level, we have a Ministry of Skills sitting out there that is trying to design policies. We have NSDC that has commissioned something called a Sector Skills Council. I don't know if many of you know about the Sector Skills Council. I happen to be on a couple of committees like everybody is. I'm also part of the nitty-gritty of 1 or 2 Sector Skills Councils. And I'm going to admit very freely and frankly over here that I think we started off with the intention of building this industry-academia bridge, and that is what the Sector Skills Councils were about. I think in creating the bureaucracy of the NSTC, et cetera, we have lost our way somehow. And we and I'm calling to the writing community first, and the journalists in the room first, to call again and ask, where and how is this industry-academia bridge being built? Because as far as I can see, operating standards, et cetera, are being delivered by the Sector Skills Councils, which basically creates more training shops. So fine, we're creating training for lots of people. How is that actually impacting the academia? How is it, what is it informing schools? We need to come back on track on that one. Individual solutions, each of us knows many, many NGOs and foundations that are doing very, very good work in this one. Too many to name over here. The institutional solutions come from all of us, because each of us here represents an institution or the capability to work as an institution. And sorry, Professor Saab and Kailashji, you presented the L's and the 5 E's. They're a bit old-fashioned. We now have acronyms that mean things. And I will now propose to each of us a way to escape from this trap that we have found ourselves in, where teachers and school leaders don't know how to change things in the classroom, where vice chancellors are saying, yes, I know I must build this, connect with industry. So how do I do it? And therefore, I am presenting an acronym called ESCAPE, which is what we need to do. We need to escape from where we are trapped right now. We know what we want to do. We want to do it. We don't know how to do it. E is the first one, which is engage. Not easy, actually, to step up to Kailashji and say, namaste, please, I want to learn from you. Not easy, it's very daunting, even for me who has spoken on stage a lot. Each of us can just send a letter to the industry that we want. Sir, you're from Blue Star. Please expect many letters from people in this room. If this event is a success, it will be because you have written letters. As educationists to industry, you have engaged them. As industry, you have sought connect with vice chancellors and schools. Engage with them, listen to them. The second, and this is a very fundamental principle in education, scaffold. We do not have a building yet, but whenever you see a building constructed, you will see a scaffold, that external bamboo structure tied up alongside. So in education literature, you always have school assistants, class assistants, para teachers, and things like that. Here, as a system, I'm saying, till we have this fantastic structure of industry academia in place, let us simply build scaffold structures. Let's try things. The C stands for capture. Any gains that you do, manage to achieve in this engagement. One letter you wrote, somebody responded. So you've created that scaffold, you created a pilot project. Something good would have happened there. And I will commend NASA for this one, for example. NASA is a very popular organization, and we keep hearing school reports that turn out to be fraud later on of Indian students who have achieved at NASA. But you know, actually, NASA in its last year commemorated an anniversary by creating 100 school projects open to college and school children. Most of them were open only to higher education and university children, where they said, here is what we want to build for the future. Elon Musk stepped up and funded many of them, saying, we want to build space settlements, we want to build more Mars rovers and other planetary rovers, we want to build the ability to do more things in new spaces. Now, which school, if they get this invitation from a NASA-based research organization, and an authentic one, and this was authentic, would not respond and have some of its more able students respond to that? We could have similar structures in an agricultural university reaching out to ITC's agrotech unit. But when you have these gains, when that project has been run, capture those gains, which could mean give them marks, certify them, get them some other qualifications, get them a summer internship, something that they could use and create value later on in life. Admit. Create pathways, and this goes out to industry. Create pathways for these people who have captured these certificates, the students who have captured these certificates, to find employment in your organizations. If a class 9, 10, 11, 12 student has done some very good research work, has created an innovation that helped their society, their community, let's not be solely dependent on marks. The tyranny of marks has gone on long enough. We need to get that gain into industry. And the same goes out to universities and teachers. If somebody's done good work in the community, admit them into your school. Give them a pathway in. Pivot. Every entrepreneur knows that. We will make mistakes along this way. Let's accept that. Let's learn from that. Let's quickly pivot. And finally, the E, once you've figured out how it's done once, expand it. And iterate. Do it again and again. Do it for a small project, try it out, learn from your mistakes, and then expand it. Do it again and again. Very simple steps for each of us to be able to take that first step. Once the first step is taken, the next step is always, always easier. So therefore, my my time I can see is up, but I will now request two things. One, at the systemic level, at the national level, I would request the NSDC and any of us associated with the NSDC, which is the National Skills Development Corporation, which is responsible for bridging the gap, to actually start issuing literally RFPs to schools, request for projects to schools, funded by the industry, saying, our industry needs this information. Can a student do this little bit of research? Let them get marks for it. And the second request goes out to organizations such as the Hindu over here. I would love to see a Hindu annual student research competition. And that is a request that goes out publicly, directly. If you are in a position to create something like that, which gives value to students, confidence and abilities to them, let's do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meeta. I think we're all set to see how we escape from the traps we are all onto, and that hinges on what Kailash so beautifully put, that education is for liberation. And I think the educators here for a moment should just reflect and introspect on where are we in this liberation, or are we tied to the demands of Marx and what we think is the way to perhaps economic sustainability moving to colleges. And that is where comes the corporate view. I don't know if I'm pressurizing Sujit to stick to the corporate view, but I would love Sujit to talk about his perspective on these gaps.
So every speaker is allowed to quote one statistic or a recent study that they went through, and here is mine. While on the car, driving down to this hotel, I recently read about this study that when you sit in a conference, clapping hands is very good for blood circulation. So why don't you all clap once, please? Yeah. I don't know whether I'm going to get one after the session, but let me get it in advance. And thank you for the kind words. To me, this topic has been something which has been beaten to death for literally over the last 10, 15 years. Every time there is a mild recession, we talk about skill gap. During a good year, we really don't talk about it, because during a good year, even trespassers will be hired into any of these companies, right? As long as you have a degree, come on board, no interview, nothing. But jokes apart, as a moderator rightly said, probably this is a time when the skill gap is so wide because of the speed in which the technology is changing. So even before giving my corporate view, I exactly have 9 minutes, so let me spend 2 minutes on that. I think the speed in which technology is changing, I don't know whether our academia as well as our industry is able to cope up with this particular speed, right? I don't think employment as such is a challenge. I don't think getting a job is a challenge. But I mean, in my definition as an HR person, there's a fundamental difference between a job and a career, right? You do a job for a living, and you can do any job for that matter. But a career is built on your strength. A career is built on what you study. And the biggest challenge India is facing today is what am I studying in college and what am I landing up after 4 years? Now that actually is a big, big problem statement. A former president of India who said 2020, India will be a superpower. And if Abdul Kalam was alive today and we have to go and ask him, will India be a superpower by 2020? The answer will be probably 2025 or 2030. We all talk about our demographic dividend where we say by 2020, India will be the youngest population in the world. 27 years will be our average age. China, because of the one-child policy, will be at 47. Western Europe is at about 45. Brazil is the other country which will have a young population. Even United States of America has an older population. So we all took great pride. We have the youngest workforce. But let me also tell you, that's a time bomb ticking. Because in India, we have this unwritten rule that every child who completes 12th standard has to first become an engineer and then decide what you want to do in life. First finish engineering, then we will decide, right? Because even today, there are only two glorified professions in the world, in our country, medicine and engineering. If you choose arts, you are looked down terribly by your parents, by the society, and so on and so forth. And why is that? Our workforce are the so unhappiest lot. Gallup, which is a worldwide number one human research organization, gives you these alarming statistics that only 2 out of 10 people in the world actually use their strength at work, which means I'm good at something and have an opportunity to display my strength at work day in and day out. And needless to say what the Indian statistics is all about. It's almost as less as 0.5%. Because only in India you'll have a civil engineer, petrochemical engineer, chemical engineer, aeronautical engineer, electrical and communication engineer, all will end up in an IT industry. Or suddenly somebody will say there's a whole lot of developmental assignments coming in, a lot of road bridges are built, so everybody will take up civil engineering. Now, if we are going to chase a job, let me tell you, the first 2 years it will be exciting, and after 2 years life will be miserable, because we live in a society where there are certain things which needs to happen at a particular age. By the time you are 30 years, you need to be married with a kid, with a car, with a 2-bedroom apartment and a 20-year loan already there. And for the rest of your life, you keep earning for the loan. At 35, 36, you want to quit your job and go do something else, but then this loan stares at you, and then you lead a frugal life, basically surviving. And at 45 years, we will be advising our children, you know what, if only I knew what I was good at, I would have changed the world. Nothing would have happened. Literally nothing would have happened. And if we really wanted to make the change, we would have done it already. So my request is, forget about what the industry wants. What the industry wanted 10 years back, 15 years back has not changed. When you attended an interview 10 years back or 15 years back or even 20, 30 years back, what was the first question which was asked to you? The same stale question, tell me something about you. Or introduce yourself. Now tomorrow if your kids are going to come for an interview to any of these top corporates, what is the first question which is going to be asked? It's the same question, tell me something about you. Our Nobel laureate spoke about coaching industry, which is about a $23 billion industry. Now there is even bigger industry which coaches engineering kids or coaches students to crack entrance tests and clear interviews. I recently went into a college, I did a mock interview for about 50 students and about 500 students were on the audience. I have to call each student on stage and do a mock interview and then give insights to the students on how you can pick up some skills. 7 interviews I completed and I was just flabbergasted because all 7 of them, except for their father and mother's name, everything else was the same. Everything else was the same, including the hobby. All 7 kids gave me the same hobby, reading books, watching TV and listening to music. I said, this is funny. How is that possible? And then the 8th kid tells me, sir, we are trained by a particular company, a training company, where all 50 of us will be put into a classroom. And this is, by the way, a top engineering school in Chennai. We'll be put into a classroom and the workshop is called Tell Me Something About You. For 2 days, the kids will be made to sit and they'll ask you, tell me something about you, tell me something about you. And the kid will say something. The guy will say, no, this is not what corporate wants. Change it. Change this. So literally, and I said, how is it all of you have the same hobby? Because they said, so there's 3 hobbies, you can't ask us to display anything. So if you say, I read books, they have given us 10 titles. I can pick up one book and say, this was the last book that I read. Watching TV, what's the maximum that you will ask? You will say, what kind of programs do you watch? And I will say Discovery Channel, BBC, CNN, IBN, and whatnot. I will not talk about Sun TV or JRTV or whatever TV, even though he watches that. Or listening to music, I can't play the tape recorder and say, listen to this music. So we are literally preparing our students for a disaster to happen. I think the way forward, my dear friends, if you want our students to build a very, very effective career, teachers have to be the biggest career counselors, and that career counseling needs to happen much, much early in their age, not after they finish their 12th standard. Because we literally light up the stove when they are in 8th standard. We keep telling them public exam, public exam, public exam. Literally everything is cut. And we cheat our students. Only 10th standard. Once you score good marks in 10th standard, 11th and 12th, it's cakewalk. And we ask students to score 1,202 out of 1,200, including 2 marks for handwriting. Right? And then say, you get into the top engineering colleges, 4 years of struggle, and then you have the top IT companies, the top MNCs will come and grab you and go. Yeah, we grab you and go. And many of you in this hall do not know what happens after they come into this so-called large corporate houses. Because when I don't have an opportunity to display my strength, when my heart lies in a particular subject, and when I'm doing something else, how on earth can I be satisfied at work? How on earth do you think this kid will come to work on a Monday morning looking forward to work? I come and work for my paycheck, and that's a disaster for this country. And if you ask anybody who's successful, people who have been successful, who do exceedingly well, are those individuals who just love their job. They're passionate about what they're doing day in and day out. And for these people, whether it's a Friday or a Monday or a Saturday or a Sunday, doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter. I think it's high time for us as teachers, in my mind, I'm sorry I'm saying this, I don't think we should be really bothered about what industry wants. Let's prepare our kids for life. Let's give them basic survival skills. Right? I think that's important. Because a banking industry will want something, an IT industry will want something. Now today they'll say C, C++, Java, Oracle, Kulangal, whatever, right? No, but you can't be training them on day in and day out. Yeah. And if, for example, 2020, the top skills of 2020, let me tell you, not even a single institution is just focusing on. Because the job which is existing today will not exist in 2020 is what the prediction is all about. Look at what are the top skills which is required in 2020. They're talking about acute problem-solving skills, critical thinking, agility, collaboration. Now, where is collaboration in schools and colleges? In schools, it's always about I am class first. I am class. Now, yesterday I dropped my son in the school, and there is a parent who's telling my wife, this kid who's coming in is my child's competitor. So the child plays tennis. So I said, oh, he's a tennis player? No. In academics, he's my competitor. In which class? Class 7. Right? So I think we should stop looking at these mark-producing machines, because we even put God to shame. Xerox is not the best photocopying machine. Our children are the best photocopying machine. Memorizing machines, right? We produce exactly what is there in the textbook, and we think we are brilliant. I'm sorry to say that that's not what the future looks like. Collaborative skills is absolutely essential. Learnability, your ability to learn something today and your ability to unlearn what you learned yesterday. I think that's very, very essential. I do have a long list of solutions that can be offered, but I see that about 21 seconds, and I really want to respect my moderator. But let me tell you, if a problem has to be solved, we can pass the buck saying industry is responsible, academia is responsible, government is responsible, these policy makers are responsible. Yes, we are all responsible, and we can keep blaming for the rest of the next 50 years. My suggestion, my invitation to you is, yes, we are aware of all these challenges, but amidst all these challenges, what is that one thing that I can do to make a difference, right? I truly believe one single man can make a difference in the respective institution, and you will be seen as a role model teacher. And if at all there's one thing that I want to suggest to the government of India, one single change that you want to make teaching the highest paid profession in the country, all your problem will be solved. Thank you.
That was, I think, fantastic. It reminds me, every year we take a delegation to this country called Finland, and I think the teachers there are the most respected, the most economically respected and societally respected too. I hope India does follow that, and behind all the humor that Sujit's talk, I think, evoked, I think there is a lot for each one of us here, be it school principals, teachers. Behind the laughter, I think there should be the reflection, and every time we hear a teacher say, what skills, what are you trying to tell me, I can't cover the portions, I think we have to remind them that there is more to do in education about uncovering rather than covering, and thanks so much for that. I just want to take a few questions, and probably again going by the time, a minute each by each one of you. Meeta, I just want to ask, what could be the paradigm shift, or could you throw a light on this thing about the paradigm shift and better understanding of these gaps, if at all it's relevant today?
I think what we have to recognize today is, and this is why I use the acronym ESCAPE, is that we are trapped in a situation. Our teachers honestly don't have the kind of support or the knowledge or the ability to recognize the shift, and that's the paradigm shift that we need to make. And in schools, I think, and I did mention it earlier, the one thing that we need to do is recognize what is valuable to life, to society, and to employers. And you did mention some of these 21st century skills. What do I want as an employer? What do I want to see as somebody in the society? I want to see somebody who is responsible. I can rely on that person. Somebody who can solve problems. Not somebody who's just sitting there helplessly when you can see that the client is out there and you're sitting there helplessly with your hair in different directions or whatever. Just go there, deal with the situation, and solve it. I want to see people who can get the job done. So yes, you have these 6 C's in 21st century skills, and all of it will get done collaboratively. But this is where I want to see some empathy being built, some connect being built with the real world in schools, where you are, as a teacher, encouraging your students in every moment to create value for others, not selfishly, for others.
Thank you. Empathy, value, I think very, very important in the current scenario. I have a question for Sujit. I mean, I think you raked up a very important aspect of coaching for interviews, but it also rests on the fact that corporate recruiters like do you have, or do you imagine any other way of recruiting to see the true capabilities and skills that are built into children apart from the marks and how they answer?
Oh yes. So I think the marks is more of an entry criteria, and what is required in our current education system, it should be a cakewalk for any student to score about 70% in the bar. But I think as recruiters, what we focus on is something called as a competency-based interviews, right? So I am hiring for a particular role, and this role requires 5 set of competencies, be it communication skills, analytical and logical reasoning, team playing skills, your agility and learnability, and your flexibility. Let's assume that these are the top 5 questions required for a competency. Most of these questions are open-ended. We ask students to say, okay, give me an example where you led a team. This has nothing to do with this domain, right? And these are open-ended questions where you allow the kid to speak, and then you get into the probing question, number 1. Number 2, in terms of subject and domain knowledge at an entry level, I'm talking more at an entry level, at a subject and domain knowledge, what is required is at least 1 or 2 level depth in the subject, not merely giving me a definition of what this book talks about. I think what my fellow speaker spoke about, apart from books, what really have you done in college, right? I mean, I always say this, you can literally hijack an interview by giving facts and figures of what you achieved in college. That bit of community work that you have done, okay, that bit of extra volunteering work that you have done, you don't know what the interviewer, and after all, there is a human being sitting on the other side. You can literally hijack the interview, take him to your comfort zone, and still grab the job opportunity. We really don't want bookworms, right? The bookworms don't necessarily get the job. The students with a wholesome personality, even with a basic first class, but they are good at ABCD skills, always find a job. And since a lot of teachers are there, now there is this term called multi-potentialite, which means gone are the days when we said you need to excel in one particular area. But Gen Y apparently has this ability to excel in many, many different areas, multi-potentialite. I think it is very important for us to nurture that, and we look for such multi-potentialites when we hire.
That's fantastic. I just don't hope that there is another $1 billion industry created with a new formula and coaching for the same. So that's something we all have to be really wary about. And my last question to Professor, I think at the helm of a university and the higher education, what is your, a couple of advice for the school reforms? I mean, we see that as educators, every grade 1 teacher has a problem with the kindergarten teacher because she's not giving the kindergarten kids with a set of stuff that she can capitalize on in grade 1. The same thing happens between grade 5 and grade 6, and I'm sure the same thing is happening between a grade 12 and a entry into a higher education as well. So do you have any mantra, I mean, so as to say, for the school reforms?
The only thing I can talk about school reforms is, right now, they're overburdened and they don't do anything with their hands. So please engage them in projects. They could be very simple projects, but which will make them think on their own. I have seen a lot of people who come with degrees from India, school. They're very good in remembering things, as Sujit was mentioning. But they fall flat when you ask them to work with their hands.
Right.
So this dearth of experiential learning, if you can somehow mitigate that, I think it will go a long way so that they can think.
I think that's a great take home, and again, interpreting experiential learning and not again making it shallow in its own sense. These are some of the things that we can all, as educators and part of a community that cares for the future of the generation. And I think I'm going to go back also with this time bomb ticking that Sujit spoke about, and I think that's where we all need to probably even look at the draft National Educational Policies of 2016, which is again being critiqued as just talking or overemphasizing on the skills bit. And do we need to also look at it from a larger aspect of living well, as we say in Chrysalis, and not just zoom into mere job entry and requirements. And like Sujit talked about, do we know the difference between job and a career, and beyond the career, being a meaningful human being. So with that, I think we will close the panel discussion, but do we have questions specifically for any of the panelists?
If you have any questions, please do send them to us now, as I had requested earlier. If you've got anything written down, I see somebody there with a question. Could somebody just collect it?
So there's a couple of questions. There's one from Mr. Sujit. Certain companies are not allowing students with arrears to appear for walk-in interview. What is your opinion on this?
Okay, please don't quote me outside. This is not my company's point of view. In my personal point of view, I think any student should be allowed, because the arrears can be because of multiple reasons. And if marks was the only criteria for somebody to be successful, I should not be sitting here on this stage. I scored 71 in mathematics, not out of 100, out of 200 in 12th standard. And now I recruit engineers, right? And that's because I hated my maths teacher, unfortunately, and I showed all my anger on this subject. Because there are ups and downs in somebody's life, and in a large population like us, that's more used as a filtering criteria. But such students need not be worried about their entry level. So they work for a small company, and they can always come into mainstream in 2 years. Nobody's looking at the marks, the degree, or which college you're from. But my personal view, I think if the student has the required skill and can crack an interview, should be given an opportunity.
Yeah, and I think some kind of a movement has begun with the big five, the consulting companies, saying that, it's no more about marks or even the institute that you come out for. So let's also relax with little more of hope than despair that such topics can evoke. One question for Mr. Dr. Bagchi, the need for high levels of English proficiency above technical skills. Is it also responsible for the unemployability? What do you think about that?
This is something that absolutely essential, because I came after 35 years, and I had, my old memory was Tamil Nadu, people spoke good English. And I must say, I was absolutely frustrated. People today can't write one page of English, maybe even one paragraph correctly. Or they cannot verbally explain things in simple, understandable English. This is something, as we become more global, you like it or not, English is the language of business between countries or for social interactions. This is something we must work on. You know, I often joke that British give us two things important. One is the railways, the other is English. And if you look at India's service success, it was English which helped us. And now we are losing that advantage also to the Philippines. So yes, it is absolutely important that we strengthen our English.
But also to understand what we mean by high levels of proficiency, and I think that's a larger topic. Meeta, there's a question for you, and I think this would be the last question in the interest of time. I'm sure you're going to love this question in your own way of how you interpret it. In most of the times, research findings are not taken for policy making by the administrators, being sidelined by political parties. How do we overcome this in India, and what is your view on this, Meeta? This is specifically at you.
Thank you for that question. And again, that's a skill, isn't it? How you present your work and how you work to influence somebody. A policy advocacy program isn't simply about presenting a bunch of research. Every professor knows, for example, that the kind of academic work that you present to your peers or in journals is far more technical than what you do in a classroom. When you are talking to a different audience, you talk in a different style, you talk to their interests. When you're teaching in a classroom, you're not going to use all the language that you read in your, say, B.Ed psychology. You are going to actually use your skills and implement it differently. The same thing applies to the government. And I must say that research is actually, and inputs are actually received very well by governments if you present them in small bite-sized units. There's a whole series of issues about attention span. It's just another skill.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have a few more questions, but I think we are running out of time. I want to thank the organizers, the Hindu and Blue Star for giving us this opportunity. I think this can never be conclusive, but it's going to raise a lot of gem of ideas and thoughts in our own mind in whatever capacity we have come to join the day today. Thank you so much. Been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much to all our panelists and to our moderator. Just a few key takeaways from this discussion is that we need more industry-academia partnerships. They should be increased. We need more innovative thought among students. This cannot happen with rote learning. We need to create value in our students and not just knowledge. We need to stop stressing on marks, most importantly, and to engage our students in research and projects so they start using their intelligence and not just clogging it with information. As Mr. Sujit Kumar also said, this obsession with engineering and medicine and our stereotypical lifestyles needs to be changed. And the most important thing that he said, increase the salary of our teachers. They deserve the most. They are adding the most value to our country, and they deserve the most. Thank you very much. I'd like to call upon Mr. R. Aravindan, Executive Vice President, Electromechanical Projects Business, Blue Star Limited, to please present a little token of our appreciation to our speakers and moderator. Beginning first with our moderator. Thank you very much, ma'am, for chairing that session so ably, Ms. Chitra Ravi. Are you all tired? Thank you very much. Mr. Sujit Kumar. Mr. Prabir Bagchi. And last but certainly not the least, Ms. Meeta Sengupta. Our speakers are going to be here for a short while. You can catch any further questions that have been missed out offline with them if you need to. All of you look like you need a cup of tea or coffee. I know I do. We'll break for a short 10 minutes. Do collect your tea or coffee. The reason why we've got tables there is so you can come and keep it here and you don't have to stand outside and drink it. Please do carry them back in here with you in the interest of time so we can maintain the time frames that we need to. As you can see, we have a rather packed schedule today. Thank you very much. Do enjoy your tea or coffee. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your tea or coffee, as the case may be. I must say, though, that I'm a person who's hosted these kind of events many times over as an MC, and this is the first time I've seen the audience actually responding to that bell and coming in. And I don't think we need to question why. To talk to us now on the topic, a conscious education, harness passion, embrace creativity, we have with us a gentleman who has been passionately advocating the need to look at one's culture and heritage for clues as to the direction for a contemporary architecture and sustainable development relevant to the Indian context today. He has enthused children in conservation and has been nominated as a social entrepreneur fellow of the Ashoka Foundation, Washington, in 2004. He almost single-handedly won India's nominations for UNESCO's World Heritage Site status for Champaner Pavagadh in 2004 after a 22-year campaign. He is a much awarded and decorated architect on the Indian and world stage. The list of these awards runs into multiple pages. He is a much sought-after speaker, and I'm sure will keep us all riveted over the next hour. Please join me in welcoming celebrated architect, Mr. Karan Grover. Before I let you speak, sir, may I request Mr. C.P. Mukundan Menon, Executive Vice President, Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Products, Sales Group, Blue Star Limited, to present flowers and a memento to Mr. Grover. If you'd like to come up on stage, please, sir. Thank you. So, there you go, sir. The floor is yours now. Thank you very much.
It's great to be here. Thank you to The Hindu, a paper I respect, admire, and it's the first pickup from the shelf of newspapers. And thank you to Blue Star, which has made this happen. I live in Baroda, and I've lived there for the last 45 years. I practiced from there, from this small office which is on the screen. And I gave about 30 years of my life to look after a buried city of Champaner, which I shall talk later. But at this site, there was a little stream which becomes the Vishwamitri River for Baroda. And these crocodiles come to drink water from the stream at Champaner. And when I moved into my office, a little boy came up who I have never seen. I don't know who he is. I don't know his name. And he said, "Do you see these crocodiles coming?" And, you know, we are on the river Vishwamitri. And I could see these 22 crocodiles coming. And he said, "You've looked after them for 30 years, so they come to look after you." Now, this was a very eerie story. And I said, "You know, who are you? How do you know this?" And before I had asked these questions, he disappeared. So every morning I go out from my window just to check if they are still there looking after me. And this is a very small home where I live. That orange roof in the center was the car pouch. Where you see my dining table is where I used to park the car. And I've slowly covered it up with bamboo pergola. And that has become my living and dining room. I want to talk about, because this is an sustainability for institutions, I'd like to speak about what does the conch shell and the lotus have in common. For over 3,000 years, the Shankh has represented the voice of the people. Whilst for the same time, if not longer, the lotus has stood as a symbol of purity and independence. These are the two symbols so deeply rooted into our heritage that they have become intangible. Yet every day they continue to inspire, not only for what they are symbolic of, but also of what they represent. Free speech and independence are words not taken lightly in India, a nation that sacrificed so much to gain such rights. And while many of us today memorize a few individuals for their key roles in this movement, the truth is that it was the individuals of our nation united that brought about such change. Individuals such as these 4 angry law students, a school teacher and a college professor, who put their voices to pen and paper to challenge the discrimination practiced by the Anglo-Indian newspapers of the time. In their first editorial, titled Ourselves, published in 1878, the founders flagged 2 guiding principles in their mission statement: fairness and justice. Today, that one small publication has grown into one of India's most celebrated news publications, The Hindu, whose logo includes the lotus and the shankh. And that's why I started with these 2 images. Thank you for inviting me to your summit today. I'm very indebted to The Hindu. Since we are so close to our Day of Independence, I feel it's only appropriate that we honor those who gave us so much and asked for so little. However, I feel that today we face another battle that will require the same passion and determination to overcome. Firstly, if we have any chance for change, we must be honest with ourselves as well as with others. There is no secret movement, private sect, or conspiracy theory called green. And sustainability is not a new way of thinking created in our lifetime. In fact, the whole green theory is just green noise. Sustainability was inevitable and a natural progression of architecture and design. Understanding this is essential not only to inspire innovation, but also to curb misconceptions. In India, as you all know, we have been building sustainably for over 2,000 years, and our heritage contains key components of the vernacular that should not be ignored. Proven techniques that can be combined with today's technological advancements to create true innovation. It is only by combining the best of who we are with the best of who we can be that we will inspire passion through design. Passion that does not rely on points but on principles. Passion that inspires change. Blue Star is one such company that inspires change, not only in the products they sell, but in their values. And we heard a lot of talk this morning on values of their company. For over 20 years, Blue Star has been one of the leading voices for and of sustainability and climate change. And this goes to show their commitment to sustainability and education. It is a privilege having them sponsor this event, and Mr. Tyagarajan, thank you very much. This act of change is not limited to how we design. Instead, it encompasses every aspect of interaction within our society: how we act, how we feel, and our drive for innovation are all rooted in the very definition of change. Without the passion to teach, there would be no passion to learn. And without the passion to learn, there would be no drive for innovation, no will to inspire. And these are all words you have heard this morning in 3 I's, 4 C's, 10 E's, and so forth. What I like most about change, that it is a synonym for hope. If you are taking a risk, what you are really saying is that I believe in tomorrow and I will be a part of it. This way of thinking, this hope for the future, is the very foundation for change. When we are inspired, we utilize that ability to inspire others and instill in each other the same passion that has so deeply invigorated ourselves. While such abilities reside in us all, they must be cherished, they must be harnessed, and they must be encouraged in order to reach their full potential. While sustainability can be a broad term, awareness is its most important core value. Awareness of our surroundings and the effect we have on those surroundings is absolutely essential. But a general awareness of how we do things versus on how we should do things is important. In any field progression, it is a natural state of evolution, and sustainability is no different. Sustainability should never intimidate us, but should inspire the best in us, not only as individuals, but as a society as a whole. However, having the power to change means that we have the responsibility to change, not simply because we can, but because we should. Every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, and the passion to reach for the stars, to change the world. And all of us, no matter what is your culture or where you came from, has come from a heritage based upon the foundation of sustainability. I used to swim for India, and I came to Baroda as a swimmer, and the man in charge of the swimming pool was a professor, R.N. Mehta. He was very impressed with my swimming, but he said to me that I have been working on this buried 2,000-year-old city, so will you come with me every weekend? So for the next 200 weekends, I was with R.N. Mehta at Champaner, and in this 2,000-year-old buried city, with 115 buildings above the ground and 4,000 buildings below the ground, I learnt my architecture. And one day, I was 23 in my third year, and he said to me, will you give me 30 years of your life? I thought that was easy, and I said, yes, sir. So he said, come tomorrow, and I'll tell you what I want you to do. I want you to make this a World Heritage Site of UNESCO. Come tomorrow at 8 o'clock, and when I went at 8 o'clock in the morning, he had died the night before. But there was a big black trunk, almost as big as that speaker said there, with all his 30 years of work and my name on it. So I worked for the next 30 years at this site, uncovering. At his time, there were only 37 monuments uncovered above the ground. We uncovered another 70 above the ground. And we worked on this incredible site and eventually made it a World Heritage Site for India as the first individual in the world who had done it for a country. And President Kalam was so impressed when he heard this story. I went to call him at Rashtrapati Bhavan. So he said that he would come and put the World Heritage plaque on our site. He also promised, ultimately we won the the greenest building in the world for the CII, and he promised that he would use these ideas of sustainability in Rashtrapati Bhavan. And I'm very happy to tell you that before he left, the only two buildings in the world of the largest democracies in the world, the White House and Rashtrapati Bhavan, are actually green buildings. These techniques were all envisaged in ancient times, where they were utilized to provide a function beneficial to the environment, the building, and its inhabitants. Now in modern times, it is our duty to reimagine these techniques and develop promising solutions to problems that are far more complex. As an architect, I have always challenged myself to design buildings that make sense, not only when dealing with structure, but also when thinking about the environment. Over the past 30 years, I have experimented with different methods of sustainability, consumption, and efficiency. And I have concluded that there are many different ways to construct responsibly for a single environment. So after my practice of 10 years as a partner, and I decided that I wanted to practice on my own, I felt that it was very important to decide what was the kind of practice. So I made these 6 drawings, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the 6th is missing, on what was the architecture I was going to practice. And I said it was the introverted architecture where the garden was contained and not a container. It was the architecture of place. It was going to use the vernacular like that beautiful jali which you see on the right, made by an uneducated woman in mud. And, we were only able to make jalis like this, which were not half as beautiful as what we inherited. So it was this background. It was this background of the kind of work we said we would do. And the other thing I have to tell you is that when we started architecture, thank you for coming, when we started architecture, everything was very time-bound, everything was very restricted. You were an architect, I was the client, somebody else was a consultant. But now things have become blurred. And I think that is very special. I was doing a project for Indira Gandhi when she was the Prime Minister. And we were trying to recreate the center of the sun, 100 million degrees Celsius to make energy. So I was sitting next to her in the PM's office, PMO conference room, and I was expecting her to lead the meeting. And she didn't. So, 1 second passed, 10 seconds passed, 20 seconds. She said, come on, you're the chairman. And I didn't know what to say. There were 97 consultants. But I have to tell you something, that the other day, at a project where we were going to do a hotel for somebody, the client said to me, I want a 240-room hotel. And while the clients were speaking, I was doodling on the site, on my table. And I said, madam, we can only get 180 rooms. She said, what a pity. It would have been nice to have 240. So we sketched and did some more work. And I'm happy to say that eventually when we made the presentation 2 hours later, we were still at 180. And I was dying to say I'm right. See, I told you 180. And my facade consultant very quietly says, Karan, I've got 240. And there's pin drop silence in the room. No one knew what I was going to react. And I said, let's run. And he was a facade consultant. He wasn't an architect. So just to tell you that it's very important that in today's time, we work together, and that the principles of design that you take, you look at climate, you look at materials, you look at how you locate a building, you look at how you even position the building, north-south instead of east-west. And this is a project just to tell you the kind of process, how you distribute openings, how you use wind towers, how you use courtyards, how you use jalis. And people tell me that it is all very old-fashioned. But let me also say to you that this building doesn't look old-fashioned at all. So that's the point I was trying to make, that when you look at tradition, you take tradition and you understand that our buildings worked so well in the climate that they did, and then you try to find out how you want them to work today. So I remember going to this client, and he had this long road, and the client said, I want my building to face the main road. And I said, sir, you can't, it's in the wrong direction. So your buildings have to face almost at this funny angle, the diagonal, because that's really facing north-south. And he said, but what will that look impressive? And we said, yeah, that can look pretty impressive. The point is that you've got to get the location of the building right. You've got to work with the climate. So it is not a question of looking at the road that is important, but the fact of how you really work with the climate. And it is this attitude that we have even gone on to now. We are trying to produce the first net zero factory building. So just to tell you that to reduce the energy and then to produce the equivalent energy to run the building. So it is very important that when you start with the tradition, the vernacular to save energy, the building costs are much less than when you work ignoring it and you have this enormous building cost at the end. I also feel that we should use technology. This is the first time we can say how we change the angle of the building. Is the first time we can decide how much of the facade is shaded. All this we didn't know 30 years ago. And this is something that we can do with technology. The fact that these are details of the inside of a room where we chose that a 12-meter width, which is the last image, can get approximately 100% daylight, which is something that we could never do before. So I'm not against technology. I'm just saying that we must use technology wisely. And if we do, then even doodles like this at a design charrette, this is facing due north and south. But then if you twist the building by 13 degrees, it is still possible to get the same ideas, and that's how you get buildings like that. And the very fact that today you can quantify performance. So we quantified the form, the fenestration, the construction assemblies, the lighting optimization, and we were able to say that in 10 years we could save 15 crore worth of energy in this building. So I think it's very important that the fact that you can quantify today the performance of a building. As my friends and sponsor Blue Star are in this business, let me say that alternatives to conventional air conditioning are urgently required. And we must look at ways into innovating existing methods. Like, for example, we have used these towers in our building, which won the Platinum Award, to cool the air by 11 degrees Celsius before it goes into the air conditioning unit to supply. So we have to cool the air by 9 degrees instead of cooling it by 20. And other methods for not only cooling air but producing energy as well. It is a well-known fact that the higher you are, the cooler you are. Now, how can we capture this coolness at that height and redirect this coolness to a place where it is needed? And this is what this architect has done. In the AC towers in Dubai, the floors on top, the air which hits the building on top, are 10 degrees cooler, cools the air inside by 10 degrees, and that itself is brought down and is able to achieve a 40% energy saving. So it is quite something extraordinary. So eco-friendliness, energy efficiency, sustainability are key building systems, even for these technological towers which dominate our skyline. The Oasis Tower, again in Dubai, said there is less land for farming. And could we do a building which would integrate farming inside the building? So this building is able to grow food for 40,000 people every year. It will be capable of generating electricity requirement by its own. In another tower, the Gulwing Tower, again in Dubai, this facade has got little turbines which produce energy. And the shape of the building is curved, so it produces a tornado effect to encourage these turbines to create energy. Now, I have a friend, Min Suk, in Korea, and he's a very well-known architect, and he was asked when Barack Obama was first nominated, he was asked to make a temporary structure in Denver at the Democratic National Convention. So he built this air forest, 60 meters long and 25 meters wide, of 9 hexagonal canopy units, 4 meters in height, inflated them with blowers. The columns are 5 meters apart. There are these little silver mirrors which are able to reflect the light from outside. The nylon fabric is coated with these dots, and it is just an extraordinary idea on building. So the same Min Suk says that suppose we own less, can we share more? So he thinks that when you own everything, you will only get buildings like this. But if you don't have everything, but you share only, you have minimum spaces which are yours, and you share larger spaces, then you can maybe get buildings like that, and our cities can look quite different. It is known that people ignore design that ignores people. In India, we are faced with challenges in every region, environment, and ecosystem. As our population increases at an astonishing rate, our infrastructure suffers. As climate change affects our rural areas, our urban centers become more congested. This cause and effect situation is compounding our problems, and it is also amplifying them. As a bad situation turns worse, and we heard about it this morning, we are bombarded with endless aspects of the modern era. In India, our citizens have greater access to an iPhone than a toilet, and that is terrifying. And since this absurd conundrum is true, imagine how many people in India fail to have access to clean water, affordable housing, modern conveniences, or even electricity. Clearly, the way we have tried to manage these situations have been inadequate at the best. These modern times require modern thinking, which was said again and again this morning. We cannot think the way we have been thinking. We require modern thinking and an in-depth understanding on how to plan for the future. Because while a clear understanding of urbanization is vital, equally important for our great minds of tomorrow is the willingness to embrace creativity. Educators like all of you must challenge students on their ability to adapt to unforeseeable change. And students must be taught to think differently, unconventionally, or from a new perspective. That is your role. You cannot do it the way you have been doing it. You have to change. All of you have to change. Simply thinking outside the box is no longer good enough. Our students need to embrace creativity and to think beyond it. The educator's role will become much more difficult because there is a fine line between creative genius and absolute rubbish. A very fine line. And educators must challenge students to think to that point. That doesn't mean that they should not dare themselves to think further. But the focus needs to be on practical solutions for the future, not theory. Integrating sustainability into your educational systems requires a firm understanding of your heritage and my heritage. But it also requires a clear vision of the future that is fluid, the future that is ever changing, the future that is constantly adapting to innovation and efficiency. Again, two words we were told about this morning. So without change, there is no innovation, creativity, or incentive for improvement. Those who initiate change will have a better opportunity to manage the change that is inevitable. So the spirit of creativity goes far beyond that definition. It requires the courage to let go of certainties and enter a realm where anything is possible. As Albert Einstein put it, logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will take you everywhere, anywhere. And this creative spirit lies in each of us and each of you and all of us together. And it awaits a single spark of clarity that truly has the power to change anything. Creative imaginations are the driving force of every innovation. And without such innovation, there is no spark, there is no challenge, and there is no inspiration. If creativity is thinking up new things, then innovation is creating new things. Educators know this to be true, perhaps more than anybody else, which is why they challenge students to become motivated and involved. I think this is the biggest issue. How do you challenge students to become motivated and involved? Because this creative spark is not found through force. You cannot mandate it. It is ignited. It is ignited by a single idea that leaves the individual questioning everything. So if imagination is an idea, and innovation is the physical product of that idea, then inspiration is innovation sparking the imagination. So while this may seem like a complicated theory of my own design, I assure you it's not. We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. And without intervention, this could be likely to go on for 1,000 years more. Unfortunately, we are placed with serious problems today that may require some far out thinking to solve. The kinds of ideas that arise from the intangible and challenge our very understanding of what is possible. Today we have access to a wealth of knowledge like never before in the history of mankind. Knowledge that can be learned from others and information that can be passed on. After all, how can we ever hope to find inspiration if our imagination is limited to our own understanding? Much education today is monumentally ineffective. All too often, we are giving our young people and people like me cut flowers when we should be teaching them to grow their own plants. Sustainability in the educational institute is not only vital, it is absolute. And this education cannot be limited to design alone, but instead must encompass every aspect of our educational system. For too long, there has been a stigma on sustainability, which is far too often associated with the unnecessary. Well, is it unnecessary to have clean water, I ask? Is it unnecessary to want clean air, I ask? Is it unnecessary to care about the environment, I ask? I'm sorry, but I fail to see where any of this is unnecessary, because in India we have a lot of work to do in order to ensure that our societies have the ability not only to survive the future, but to thrive in it. We come from a heritage steeped in the very foundation of sustainability, and we must respect this tradition just as we respect all traditions. Without education, we will have no knowledge of what is right or wrong. And just how this was not our ancestors' way, it cannot be our way or the way of the future. We live in a land that is inspired. So let us be that inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grover, for that very inspiring and very eye-opening session. I'm sure it was of immense use to everyone here in the gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for the launch of a book, The Blue Star Guide to Educational Institute Air Conditioning. I would first like to introduce you all to a gentleman who is a Bachelor of Engineering in Electrical and Electronics from Madurai University and has also completed the Senior Executive Program of London Business School. He has over 3 decades of experience, having worked for reputed companies such as Larsen & Toubro Limited, BPL Systems Limited, and Voltas Limited, prior to joining Blue Star in 1998. He has handled various assignments in the service business, corporate communications and marketing, and corporate affairs and planning before he was promoted as President, AC&R Products Group in 2009. He plays an active role in various industry forums and is the past president of RAMA, R-A-M-A. Please welcome on stage Joint Managing Director, Blue Star Limited, Mr. B. Thiagarajan. I would also like to invite Mr. Karan Grover back on stage, please, sir, along with other senior members of Blue Star Limited, Mr. C.P. Mukundan Menon, Executive Vice President, Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Products Sales Group, and Mr. R. Aravindan, Executive Vice President, Electromechanical Projects Business. I'm now going to call upon our ushers to bring in the books so we can officially release them. A little louder than that, folks. We will be distributing these books amongst all of you so that you can have a good look at them as well. Please do, after the distribution is complete, let us know if you haven't received a copy and we will give it to you. Before you gentlemen leave the stage, may I request Nero Selath of the Hindu team to please come up on stage and present mementos to all our dignitaries on the stage. Thank you very much. I would now request the rest of you to take your seats and request Mr. Tyagarajan to remain on stage and tell us about this publication, which we are all waiting to lay our hands on. As he delves on it, he will also throw light on Blue Star's commitment to sustainability.